the idea for today's session is to frame the discussion around how we might mobilise the public, however that is defined, to act on the issue of climate change. The idea is that this is not just simply a question of climate science, but it's about trying to make that science both more applicable to the public and to think about the kinds of questions that come along with that. Does the public have the responsibility to take action on climate change? And if so, how do we foster effective action on climate change from the community level? What are the barriers that are being faced, and how can we overcome them? And so to answer this question, or to start working on that as a discussion, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists. On the right, we have David Midgley, who is, in this instance, representing Zero Carbon Yorkshire. We have Dr. Anna Watson from Friends of the Earth. We have Dr. Alix Dietzel from Bristol University. And we have Tracy Carty from Oxfam. So I'm going to start with a simple question for the panel, which is, what can an individual do to act on climate change? And I'm going to start actually on my left with Alix Dietzel.
Start with the scholar.
Yes, start with the scholar and then we'll move on.
So my approach for looking at what individuals should do is based on capability. So because I'm a philosopher, I had to establish first that individuals should do something about climate change at all, and that they're responsible for that action. So I looked at what capabilities individuals might have. And I suppose I'm most interested in affluent individuals who I think have a lot of capability to make quite big changes to how much they consume, how much they emit. So I started with those individuals looking at things like meat consumption, travel, the way that they buy products from all over the world, things like that. So that's kind of my starting point to look at what individuals can do within their own capability to reduce emissions. So it can have to do with shopping, eating meat, traveling, things like that. But I'm also interested in what individuals can do in terms of informing other people, inspiring other people, campaigning, and basically spreading the message. So my kind of view on what individuals can do is that they can do loads, and I'm really interested in that kind of aspect of their responsibility.
Okay, would anyone else from the panel like to sort of populate that idea about there's loads of things that individuals can do?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, start with Anna.
Yeah. I think it's important to think about. I think the capability thing is really important, actually, Alix. And I think thinking about, where you are at the moment. So, I think there's something about being gentle with ourselves about where we start. So, you don't have to be a climate scientist. You don't have to think, I've got to know how the UK is going to become 100% renewable by 2025 before I can start saying anything. I think it's starting with where you are and what you're interested in, and thinking about that. So I'm thinking about the different communities that you might be part of. So you might be here at the university, your geographical community, your community that you may have sort of online, or your hobby interests, and trying to find sort of connections. I think that's something that people can do. So I think the important thing when you're thinking about beginning to become, and I'm sure there are many people here who are very active and would consider themselves sort of, maybe climate activists, is not thinking you need to know everything before you can start, because it can be a journey, and everybody at some point may become part of it. And I think it's about the community being welcoming of people when they want to begin that journey, really, of understanding and maybe becoming active themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's a very deep sort of issue here about personal empowerment, and a lot of people feel very disempowered about this issue. It is so huge. It seems like it can appear very threatening, very doom-laden, and so I think it's important that we don't allow ourselves to kind of get sucked under by that kind of way of viewing it. There are many different ways that we can respond to it, and we really do need to, I think, find ways of relating positively. There are ways of relating very, very positively to this issue. There are a lot of very positive things happening. So I think it's very important to be well informed, but look for the good news stories. There are a lot of good news stories. There are a lot of good news stories about what will happen if we do go the right way in terms of tackling climate change. Of course, there are different approaches to it. So it's not just about cutting the carbon. It is about, I think, well, I was saying before, that our relationship with the natural world has gone very deeply wrong. And it's not just that we're emitting greenhouse gases, we are also mining the soils, we're also fishing out the oceans, we're also, doing a lot of things that are destroying the environment. But there is a new consciousness arising. There is all sorts of amazing new practices around sustainable ways of doing things. So look for those new ways of understanding and relating to the natural world that are out there. I completely echo both of the points about that. We all have different communities of influence, people that we relate to, communities and organisations that we can relate to and that we can influence, and we also have different skill sets and different aspects of knowledge. So look at where you can be powerful generally, and look at that through the lens of climate change. So if you're a poet, don't feel that you have to spend all your time researching climate science. You might have another way of communicating and influencing people. But I think very important, if you come from a positive mindset, looking at the positive possibilities, if we all start to do that, then it will stop feeling like this heavy weight that people don't want to hear about it. People resist it when it is all in terms of we're all going to die. I don't think that's true, actually. I think that we will crack this problem, but it is very, very urgent, and we need to find positive ways of engaging with it so that we will inspire people rather than just people feeling threatened.
I was going to ask the question then, how do you convince someone who moves from the position of I'm unsure or I'm skeptical about climate change to perhaps realizing that climate change is an imminent threat, and then they go to a sort of what I might call a fatalistic response, which is, oh, there's nothing we can do about it. We might as well enjoy life, enjoy my lifestyle as it currently is. Does anyone have any arguments that they might use in that situation that might be convincing to someone who thinks that way? I'm going to start at the end. Is that all right if I start with you?
I was actually going to answer the other question, so my mind's
okay. No, sorry.
Yeah, so start with someone else.
Okay, so I'll start with someone else. Do you want to
Yes.
follow up with that then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
I go back a little bit further than some of you here, and was very much involved in the campaign against the nuclear weapons in the early 1980s. And it was a very scary time, and there were extended periods when I began to feel that it was virtually certain that the human race was going to exterminate itself. And it didn't happen. So I've become very skeptical about doom-laden scenarios, I mean, I don't know if, some of you will remember that, I guess, but really it was true. There was a small booklet that was written by someone who had been high up in the US nuclear strategic planning group. So it was a very, very well-informed analysis. It was called 1 Year to Go. It was published in 1983. He was basically arguing that the arms race had reached such a point that within 12 months it was, the probability of somebody, firing a rifle across the German border and starting a nuclear war, there was no way it was going to not happen, and it didn't happen. So I've become very skeptical about that. Things are changing very, very rapidly. We are seeing, for instance, the 20% year-on-year fall in the costs of things like solar power and wind energy, 20% or 30% increase in production every year. That's an exponential trend. Very, very soon we are going to see fossil fuels are just not going to be able to compete in the marketplace with renewable energy. Look into that, for instance. There are lots of these trends that are happening. Exponential trends can cause very, very rapid change that doesn't, it looks unpredictable. If you look at things through a kind of linear forecasting lens, it looks very, very hopeless. But if you understand that some of the dynamics of these changes are going to cause things to happen and switch much faster than we think they're going to, then actually anything is, it's up for grabs. We don't know what's going to happen, and it's very, very dependent on human agency. So let's not start to feel that we don't have any agency, any influence. We really do.
Okay, Hannah?
No, I think I echo huge amounts of what David has said, and I think we just, if those of us and I know there are some in the audience, if we think back to before we had loads of digital technology, we couldn't have sort of assumed how we'd maybe, kind of be using it now, and the massive kind of revolution that's happened there. Also, we're seeing, a lot of people say, oh, well, well, it doesn't matter what I do here, because look what countries abroad are doing, look what China and India are doing. You're saying, yes, but technology's coming on so much that they can leapfrog ahead of what we've been incredibly dependent on the fossil fuel economy, and basically we're seeing technologies come on so quickly that they can leapfrog over sort of the sort of basically our rather archaic large infrastructure fossil fuel driven energy system that we've developed in the West. And I think there's, even just looking at other inspiring people and campaigns have all come from small scale actions. As we know, you can look at things like the civil rights movement, and how people came together, and it's small actions, but it adds up. And I think if people are feeling, and if any of you, in your own sort of activism are feeling that you are the only one, I think there are so many different communities that are working on things that you can basically, hook up with. The fossil-free movement is sort of global in a way, and so I don't know if any of you are involved in calling for Sheffield University to divest from fossil fuels. I don't know if that's a campaign going on. It's done. Fantastic. So you've done it. Great. So you've got that. So move on to Sheffield Council now. That's your, that can be your next. That's the next thing. And there's a whole movement of students, as I'm sure that many of you have been involved in, and around that. So you can that local to global, seeing how what you're doing here and other people are doing that around the world. I think that's they're the sorts of arguments that we would be using. And also, I think just the ingenuity of human nature. I mean, frankly, if we can put people on the moon, we've got to be able to deal with climate change.
Would anyone like to come in?
I've gathered my thoughts.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, no, I think, to echo some of what's been said, I think, emphasising solutions, the fact that change is possible, really putting a spotlight on shifts that are already happening. The decline in the costs of renewables over the last 5 years, for me, is one of the, biggest signs of progress and hope that we have. I'm not, Greenpeace predicted it, but many others didn't, and that's kind of, really gives you a lot more hope. But also, I think climate isn't zero sum, and communicating the fact that, it's not climate change or nothing. Things can be much worse. There are degrees, different temperatures, it has different impacts, and being able to communicate that. One of the challenges with something like 2 degrees is that we run the risk of a mindset where, if we pass 2 degrees, let's give up, or if we're underneath it, everything's fine. That's not the reality, and I think getting a better understanding that's helpful.
I just wanted to add that I agree with you about this idea of community and finding others. So I find something that's quite helpful when speaking to people who are kind of frustrated or skeptical about what they can do. I'd like to get them to think about the climate change problem in a different way, in a way where we're connected as a global community, where it's not just about nature or companies or money, it's about how humans are going to be affected and what that really means. And I often find when you speak to people in that way, and they get that human connection, they become more interested and more excited and say, I haven't really thought about that element of climate change too much, and I do really care about other human beings, and I do really care about human rights, and I really want to do something helpful. So I find that helps to inspire people to just care more and feel more driven to do something.
If I could just follow up very quickly on that, I think the most powerful way to get out of that disempowered state is to get together with some other people and do something, however small, and suddenly you'll start to feel different.
Okay, so you've, I think, collectively presented quite a positive or quite hopeful picture of how individuals can act on the issue of climate change. I wanted you now, in this sort of next question, on what are the barriers to actually enabling that kind of action, and how might those barriers be overcome? Who would like to start me off? Yeah, sorry, Tracy.
So just to pick, I mean, there are many barriers. Just to pick up on two. I think one big barrier is just coming at it from a political side of things, which is more my focus, is in a lot of countries, we have a situation where politicians feel that to show they care about climate change or really want to act on it is to be seen as not having their eye on the ball of the real issues that people care about, the economy, education and health. So we have a situation where politicians don't talk about climate change. That in turn reinforces, for all the cynicism in politicians, that reinforces this perception that, well, maybe it's not really a crisis. You know, I'll put it in it might not matter that much box. You know, it's like when you're on a plane and there's turbulence, you take your cues from the airline stewards. Do they look worried? Well, they don't look that worried, so I'm not going to worry. So, you know, the fact that politicians, they aren't acting in a way that shows urgency and real determination on climate change serves to reinforce a kind of society-wide denial that it's really a crisis. So I think that's one barrier. Another one which touches on the point you made and that's very relevant to Oxfam is the fact that climate change, in terms of impacts being felt now, for sure, if your home gets flooded in the UK, climate change is maybe personal now, but for most people it's a problem that's distant in space and time. A part of our role as Oxfam is that's a problem for people caring about climate change. It's out there, it doesn't affect me, I can't really see it or feel it. So, you know, a big part of our role is really to try and engage, to bring those human stories to help people understand how climate change is massively impacting on millions of people around the world now. To take one example, we have Super El Nino, which is affecting many regions in the world that are already struggling with climate extremes. It's coming on top of that, and we estimate that it's affecting about at least 60 million people, most of which are facing food insecurity. So, you know, we will play a role in trying to bring that reality to people here. That won't engage all aspects of the UK population, but those who care about overseas development, it can help switch them on.
I'd just like to add to your points, if that's okay, because they're similar to what I was going to say. What you said about politicians, another thing to think about is that politicians are not always around for a very long time. You know, it might be 5 years or less. So they're often concerned with kind of short-term problems that they can focus on. And focusing on climate change for them, you know, they may care about it, but it won't help them to win an election, or it won't be exactly what their voters are concerned with in that moment. So this short-termism of politics is really problematic. Another thing you said is that people don't seem to understand that it will, you know, who it affects, and it seems so far away from them. So most of the effects of climate change, according to the scientists, will be felt in less developed countries. And I think people really feel disconnected from that issue, and they don't always recognize it or care. So that's where that conversation comes in, where you explain to them about, you know, human rights and global community, things like that. And then a third thing I would add is sometimes there's a lack of choice. Individuals feel to actually act on climate change. So some things are simply not available, you know, for example, like free, efficient, green transport. You can't choose to do that. Some people can't choose to be vegetarian or vegan because of their lifestyle or maybe cost problems. So I think sometimes there's this idea of a lack of choice and a lack of really being able to do anything.
Can I just play devil's advocate for a moment? So if you look at polling data, particularly around elections, for what people think are the most important political issues, and as already mentioned, it's often the NHS, the economy, immigration, and education. Now, those are the four big issues. Depending on your political persuasion, you might reorder those four issues from top to bottom. But those tend to be the four ones that, in a lot of polling data across the political spectrum, tend to be the ones that come out top. Is it not the case in a democratic society that politicians will naturally go for policy measures on those issues first, and then climate change becomes a secondary effect? Is this not led from the bottom up in that respect?
Can I respond to that?
You can, yeah.
Because I was going to say, you know, the first, you mentioned three things on your sheet here: political will, knowledge, and perceptions. Those are all interlinked. And So I'm going to make a very political point here. The influence of major corporations, and in particular in this context fossil fuel corporations, in manipulating the political process and manipulating the messages that come through the media is a major problem. I was at the climate change conference in Paris in December, and one of the things I learned there was that the European Wind Energy Association has basically been taken over by the fossil fuel industry. So they have, a few small wind projects here and there, and they have stacked the Wind Energy Association with their representatives, and they have greatly weakened the policies of that organisation. That's just an example. So I think we have to be aware, we have to be realistic about the fact that there are very major forces that are really don't see tackling climate change as being in their interests, and they are acting in very uncompromising major ways to try to prevent that from happening. So we have to be aware of that, and I think this doesn't completely, this is not to kind of completely deny your point that it has to do with individual responsibility, because of course we have consumer choices which impact on that, but it's a two-way thing. People are also, they're being very consciously manipulated in their choices. So this is a serious a structural problem with our entire political system, and we see in America that it's reached crisis proportions, and it's quite serious here. This is one reason why I'm particularly at the moment engaging on a regional level, because I think it's much easier to overcome those barriers on that level. They aren't so, those forces are usually engaged at the very high level. It may be easier to get a sort of grassroots movement to build momentum to a sort of a more positive approach to climate change, and if we do that across the UK, then we may have an effective force that is countering stuff that is coming down from the top, where those professional lobbyists are working round the clock with government ministers and so on to try to skew the agenda.
And I mean, just on the points about people caring about things like the NHS and the economy, and absolutely, I mean, those are, that's right. But what's not happening is nobody is telling the story about basically we cannot afford 3 degrees. The cost to us, both in an economic sense and in a social sense and in a human sense, is so vast that actually the fact that we need to have a completely different way of thinking about our economy to basically find the solutions for climate change, that doesn't come through. No, we don't see our political leaders telling, giving that message. I mean, so obviously at Paris, people signed up to, we will, we want there to be no more than 1.5 degrees. The world has already warmed by 1. We need a drop-off of carbon emissions, particularly from the global north now. The deals on the table add up to 3. I don't think we don't know what that means. We haven't, how do we plan for that within our country? So the economic cost, the social cost, the human cost is so vast, and that message doesn't come over. And I think because it challenges the status quo, doesn't it? It means that the structures that we've got there, the type of energy system we've got there, our transport system, it challenges all of that, and it means we have to think very differently. And again, I think the human ingenuity, the innovation that could happen, obviously, we've got fantastic things going on here at this university and other universities and other sort of, in businesses that are leading innovation, that could really, be part of the solution. But, the people that basically profit from the status quo, unfortunately at the moment, are so much more powerful than we are. So a lot of the climate activism is about trying to reclaim that power. And obviously we've started to see that, I think, over the last year. Again, I think there was a lot of, after Copenhagen, there was a lot of fatigue in the climate activism movement. And I think actually we've seen, and Paris has been a moment on that journey where we started to see the energy back, and I think the opportunity is there for us. But I think we do have to realise, I think, many of us have been sort of hoping that, there could be a sort of, Martin Luther King or a Nelson Mandela sort of figure of the climate movement or whatever. And I know it's more complex than some of those issues because it's completely global. And I think what we've got to realise is we are the people we have been waiting for. There isn't a cavalry coming over the hill. And unfortunately, I know that's a really hard message sometimes. And sometimes makes me want to go home and just pull the duvet over my head and go, oh my goodness. But this is it. This is our generation's problem to solve. And basically, we've got to do it.
Can I just add to that again, being at the Paris conference, and I was in the civil society conference, which is happening alongside the governmental conference, and it was incredibly inspiring to be there with about 5,000 people who were all leaders on climate, and the amazing number of initiatives and brilliantly creative things covering every possible field. It was just amazingly inspiring to be there, and there was a sense that we are coming into our power. It was very different from Copenhagen. So I think we are coming close to a tipping point, both in terms of not only the technical and economic solutions and forces, but also there is an awakening of consciousness that is spreading around the world. The 350.org movement is incredibly powerful and inspiring. So I think, we are at a moment of opportunity, and things may look very different in a few years' time. When I mentioned about the fossil fuel lobbies and so on, they are very threatening and very dangerous, but I think that they are beginning to feel their power is weakening. It's a moment, it's a great time to be involved in this work, I think.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, a slightly awkward question, because a lot of the discussion has also been about technology. So it might be about the development of new renewable energies. On the other hand, you might also have things like the issue of geoengineering, the idea that we could essentially stop worrying about climate change because we can create a technical fix to that problem. A lot of philosophers are concerned with this as a problem of moral hazard, that if we somehow find a technological solution to climate change, then that relieves everyone's individual responsibility to act to change their lifestyles. I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that role of technology in influencing individuals' behaviour in that kind of way.
I would say I'm one of those philosophers who thinks about those things. Apart from the moral hazards and all the questions about whether it would be safe, I think the idea of relying on some future technology or some solution that would allow us to continue to live our lifestyles is really dangerous. Because as you were saying, this is not just a question of individual responsibility or politicians, it's how our political system is structured and how people get taken advantage of and how our constant growth model, everlasting growth, is dangerous. And I think by saying, oh, well, geoengineering will figure things out in the future, you're completely skirting away from that tough conversation about how we really need to change our society and how we really need to think about how we treat one another. So I'm quite skeptical about relying on some magical scientific solution, as much as I love all the scientists in the room. And thank you so much for working on technical solutions, because we need them. But it's one part of the equation, and it's not the silver bullet.
Yeah, I think that it's not impossible that we might need something of that kind, that we don't know yet the full dimensions of the climate problem. There are scientists talking about the possibility of abrupt climate change, very, very threatening possibilities with melting of the Arctic ice, release of methane from the permafrost and so on. It might be that we need to look at those interventions. But yes, very, very dangerous for them to be seen as alternatives to doing all of the other things that need to be done. We need to reconstitute our soils. They are releasing carbon into the atmosphere instead of absorbing, sequestering carbon. We need to look at the whole ecosystem and how we manage it. And the idea that this is somehow, an economic disbenefit to look after our natural environment and our natural resources. They are the sources of our wealth. We need to change our economics. It is skewed in favour of plundering the earth rather than actually looking after the earth. We need to, so that paradigm shift needs to happen. We need to structure our economics in terms of maximising human well-being instead of maximising profits for the wealthy, which is what is happening. People are hoodwinked by the idea that economic growth is something that's going to make everybody better off. It doesn't make people better off in general. In the current model, what happens is that the top 1 or 2% get better off and everybody else gets worse off. So you really have to break away from that obsession with economic growth. And there are a lot of excellent sort of models and methodologies that show ways that we can restructure our economic system to actually take better care of people and the planet.
I'm hearing, well, just, oh, sorry, would you like to
No,
come in?
no.
I was going to say, I'm hearing we in a lot of that, and part of the problem as a collective action problem is coming back to the first thing which we said, which is that to what extent is it an individual's responsibility to try and reform the entire economic system? They might feel completely powerless in the face of that. And I appreciate that collectively we might all have power to do that, but as an individual it can feel very disempowering when you say the solution is a completely new economic system, a completely new way of life, the abolition of fossil fuels. I mean, these are all big changes which an individual cannot do alone. So how do we not put people off if that can't happen?
But
Sorry.
Go on, Tracy.
Sorry, yeah, no, but equally, when people have a grasp of the climate problem and the kind of transformations that are needed, when you tell them that changing their light bulbs is going to solve it, that doesn't square. I mean, I think that the fact that climate change is an overwhelming is too big a problem for individuals to solve alone, and I actually think it can be empowering to focus on government action and the role of individuals in calling for governments to transform our societies and our economies and supporting renewables and supporting lots of other kinds of incentives. And I see, people looking after, doing what they can to reduce their footprint is absolutely essential, but actually being as loud as they can in supporting government action, I think, is even more fundamental and as empowering.
And I just think the we is very important. I think all of this has been about the fact that it's about forming connections and being part of kind of movements. So whatever here at Sheffield University, you've said that, you've already had the divestment campaign here on the university. I mean, so you're part of, that's part of that movement. And so you've done that. So you've got agency here at the university to be able to do that. So here in Sheffield, you've got agency over your city council. You're going to have mayor elections in 2017 here for Sheffield City Region. Where's climate change going to be on the debate for you as a city region in that? So even if you're thinking about, here and where you are, I was at a meeting last night with the C40 Cities group. So this is a group of global cities that are all considered to be political, their mayors want to be political leaders on climate change. Where's Sheffield? I mean, Sheffield's not on there, partly because it doesn't have enough people at the moment, but Sheffield could become part of that if Sheffield decided that it wanted to really take climate change seriously and be a political leader. So all of us sat here that, live within Sheffield, you've got agency over that. So I think we do talk about we, because it's about when we do come together, there are places we can make those changes that we have agency over, either our own lives or the communities or the institutions we work in. And they're great places to start. And it doesn't mean to say that you need to be at a march in Paris. You can start here, and you may end up at a march in Paris, but not everybody has to go there.
Yeah, completely echo that. Very well put. And so there is a space between, just changing your own carbon footprint, driving less, or putting LEDs in your light bulbs or whatever, and asking Mr. Cameron to do something about climate change. Both of those can seem like not enough. But the really deep and radical changes that you've been talking about and that I've also been talking about, they are not happening really in terms of people asking governments to change the system. Governments are not set up to change the system. They are part of the status quo. They are coming from the grassroots. They're coming from the ground up. They're coming from thousands upon thousands upon thousands of little initiatives. There's an excellent book by Paul Hawken called Blessed Unrest, if anybody's seen that, talking about this. So he was going around, addressing meetings like this all around the world, and kept on noticing that after each time he gave a talk, a group of people would cluster around him and talking to him about their little initiatives. He began to get curious how many of these things were there. After a while, he came to the conclusion there was maybe 100,000 organisations around the world working on environmental and social justice issues. He set up a database. He found that there are more than 2 million, this is about 10 years ago, and there are many more now, I'm sure, more than 2 million local organisations working on every possible issue around environmental justice, environmental sustainability, social justice, and all of these things. This is the biggest social movement in history by far. And it was very much in evidence in Paris. This is happening, and it's happening through people at a local level saying, hey, this isn't good enough. You know, my local council or my national government isn't doing the things that need to be done. I'm going to get together with some local people and take some action myself. And that movement is changing the world.
Okay. That's okay. So I suppose finally, the final question we've got before we open this up to the audience is to, I suppose, can you give any sort of effective strategies for changing opinions and initiating collective action? And just talk a little bit about essentially your own experience possibly from a campaigning perspective. Alix obviously is not a campaigner, but if you have experience from a campaigning perspective, what actually works? What, in your experience, what has worked? Would anyone like to begin?
Should I start? Since I'm
Do you
not
want
the
to start?
campaigner, and then you guys can finish.
Unless you are also a campaigner.
Well, I do a little bit, but I mean, mostly I do public engagement, which I see as kind of a way to campaign. I've already said a lot about making people look at climate change in a different way, which I think is very, very important. But another thing is just to tell people it's okay not to be perfect. It's okay not to overnight become vegan or overnight, cycle to work and never take a car again. You don't have to be perfect to be doing something about climate change, and just making them feel not like you're trying to punish them or make them feel bad about themselves, but just trying to engage them in a way where they feel useful and they feel like, oh, this small thing that I'm doing is actually important. So I think it's important not to, make these individuals feel terrible about themselves, but actually to make them feel good about themselves and say, it's all right just to do a little bit. I myself, I'm not vegan. I just try to eat vegetarian 2 out of 3 meals a day, for example, because I realize that I'm not perfect, and that's what I can do, and that's what I do, and I feel good about that. So just that message is important, being positive.
For Oxfam, as I've already said, one of our key approaches is communicating human impacts, showing how climate change is already having a massive impact on some of the most vulnerable people in the world, and as an organisation that works on the front line of human vulnerability, we can really bring those stories home and tell a global picture about its scale. But I think what's also important is, as well as galvanising outrage and concern about that, building understanding that we can make a difference. And so really, as I was saying, adaptation finance is a big priority for us. Adaptation, where we can show that that's making a huge difference to people's lives, and that adaptation can be the difference between communities going hungry or not. I think that is engaging for people.
I suppose, I don't know if it's most effective, but it's the campaigning that I love to do and be involved in is when, we're working with people on the ground that are really concerned about something. So actually it was how we met, it was some work that we were doing in the valleys of South Wales. Obviously very deprived communities, had been coal mining communities, and a very, very large incinerator was planned just above the town of Merthyr Tydfil. And we started that campaign. We were called in by some of the community and said, look, we're really concerned, we don't know where to start. And we started exactly where everybody was. So it involved large amounts of time in working men's clubs, up and down the Rumney Valley, in the villages. And those communities got themselves organised. They were door knocking. It basically had a campaign that went viral, but it was very much based on really building confidence within those communities to see that actually they have the knowledge. This was going to be won on local knowledge about, if it was suitable for, kind of issues around planning, etc. And they had that knowledge, but it was about building that confidence and empowering that community to see that they actually did that, and that was really important, and they had the agency to bring about the change they wanted. We were working with ex-coal miners. We're now supporting that community, Caerphilly Council turned down the Nankless open cast coal mine just this summer, and it was ex-coal miners that were there saying to that council, you need to turn this down. You know, we're involved in coal, but we now want a low carbon future, and open cast coal has no future in this country. And to have gone through, you know, so when we first started in Merthyr Tydfil, we hardly knew anybody, and we had people saying, I never felt that I would ever be able to do anything like this. We've now, you know, working with that community, they're so empowered that they've managed to, you know, there's very vested interest there with the company, Miller Argent, to expand their open cast, and, you know, they've won that battle. It's not over, because there's a public inquiry coming up, but I think that very much working with people, understanding who they are, understanding what their fears and their concerns are, and showing that you're on their side, and, you know, helping them build their confidence is a very, very successful strategy.
Okay. Yeah, I think connect, cooperate and collaborate. So there's an example, you know, a national campaigning organisation making the connection with the local community. So you have two kinds of strength there, which meant that that campaign was able to be successful, which it might not have been if either one of those groups had been working on that problem alone. So the things that we've done to be most effective have often been in terms of creating alliances. Just as an example, we ran a campaign in 2010 to persuade Leeds City Council to adopt a very ambitious, at the time, carbon reduction target, a 40% citywide reduction in carbon emissions by 2020. That's not so ambitious now, but in 2010 it was pretty ambitious. And we worked with all of the other environmental groups across the city. We worked with councillors from all, well, 4 out of the 6 political parties, I think, that represent on the council. And because we worked with everybody, you know, we used the kind of information resources of the university and the networking contacts of all of the different environmental groups in the city. It was an extremely successful campaign, and the council voted by 68 votes to 12 to adopt that very ambitious target. It makes it very, very difficult for them to wriggle out of their responsibilities. So I think that making those connections is another thing. And you know, different interest groups, different skill bases, different, you know, sections of the community working together makes it much more difficult to break a campaign. It brings in much more resources and different ways of working. So I always think that collaborative working is incredibly important.